I was in freshman girls chorus, the last class of the day at York Community High School when President Kennedy was shot in Dallas. I was in my dorm room at Concordia Teachers College in River Forest, just outside Chicago, when Mayor Richard J. Daley ordered Chicago police to use whatever force was necessary to subdue the protesters of the Vietnam War during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. I was driving to a Northern Conference meeting at Lutheran Hillside Village when the first plane slammed into the first tower of the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001. There may be some occasions like that were so notable, so life-changing that you remember where you were and what you were doing. And in the past 2 decades, we've had far too many tragic events that stand out in just that way. This is where I was when this happened. They're the kinds of things that stop us in our tracks, and they may keep our attention glued to the television set for hours or even days. Those kinds of events require us to reconsider some things that we've always taken for granted. They may give us a darker and unwelcome picture of who we really are. They may also make us question everything that we thought we knew. And there is another thing about these kinds of events, and that is that it takes time for us to understand what it means. It's not immediately clear to us. It's a process of thinking it over and reconsidering again and again. Jesus' friends had a number of significant "I was there" events as they accompanied Jesus. The disciples were there when Jesus made a whip of cords and drove the animals and the money changers out of the temple. We have a sense of how important this event was because it's recorded in all 4 Gospels. That's unusual. You have heard over time that the Gospel writers Matthew, Mark, and Luke tend to tell approximately the same story of Jesus' life in generally the same order. But when it comes to John, all bets are off. John tells us stories we don't hear anywhere else. The raising of Lazarus, the healing of the man born blind, several others. But here, John is telling that story. And what's interesting is that as the gospel writers, all of them reflected on what happened that day, they didn't all come to the same conclusion about what it meant. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke place the cleansing of the temple very close to Holy Week, toward the end of Jesus' ministry. Mark and Luke tell us that after this happened, the religious authorities began their plot to kill Jesus. In John, though, this story is at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. And instead of those authorities plotting to kill him, their response to Jesus is, "Who put you in charge? Where do you get the authority to do this?" And Jesus' response is not at all straightforward. In fact, the disciples don't begin to understand what he was doing until after the resurrection. And for the writer of John's Gospel, who wrote about 90 AD, many years after the resurrection, started to understand what Jesus was doing. So, in order to look at how John is presenting this, we need to look at what's happened right before it. Jesus does the first of his signs in John's Gospel immediately before the cleansing of the temple. Does anybody know in John, what's the first thing that Jesus does in his public ministry? He changes water into wine. He attends a wedding. Okay. And it's important, looking at the cleansing of the temple, to think about what John was saying about Jesus when he turned water into wine. That first of Jesus' signs is actually not about Jesus' support of the institution of marriage, but I can't tell you how many times I preached on that for wedding services. The story, instead, is really a story about rules and regulations and how those have overwhelmed the lives of the Jewish people. And we know that because John makes a great point of telling us that the water that was turned into wine was from 6 stone jars holding 20 to 30 gallons each. Why were they even at this wedding? It was for the Jewish rite of purification. So one of the rules was when you had guests come to your house, they had to wash their hands to the elbows, and they had to wash their feet. If you had servants, you had them wash feet. If you were particularly without resources, you would wash your guests' feet. And you had to have water for that. So here are these great stone jars, so that there is plenty of water to follow the rules, especially for a wedding when a lot of people were going to be there. And what John is saying is that the wine of gladness has run out for God's beloved people because they are spending so much time following the rules. And Jesus turns that on its head. Instead of water for ritual, he provides the wine of gladness. And if we do the math, it's between 120 and 180 gallons of wine. Enough to last a lifetime. And then the very next thing John tells us is that Jesus goes to the temple. And what does he find there? Well, business was going on as usual, and it seems that it was quite brisk. At the seat of worship for the Jewish people, there is an elaborate system of sacrifices. Sacrifices prescribed so that people could approach God, and those sacrifices were determined by your economic and social level. So if you were poor, we know this from Luke's Gospel, all you had to do was buy a couple of doves, which were very cheap, for the sacrifice. If you were wealthier, you might buy a sheep or goat or cattle even. So, in order to receive God's blessing and favor in the center of worship, you had to jump through some pretty elaborate hoops. And that involved money. The system of sacrifices incidentally provided jobs for a whole group of people who gathered in the temple to cater to all the rules. Jesus' dramatic and passionate action in the cleansing of the temple says, "Enough! You all have missed the point. All your rules about what it takes to receive God's forgiveness, God's favor, God's attention are just wrong. The rituals you treasure only serve to hide your hearts from yourselves because God sees you clearly anyway." After years of reflection, the gospel writer of John delves deeper yet into what Jesus was doing. Jesus is now the access point to God. He is the temple that will be destroyed and raised again. Jesus, a person, not a system, is the way into God's presence. Everything is changed. Okay. So, let's say a reporter from our time did a follow-up story on what happened that day. So going to the temple on the next day, what do you think that reporter would have found? What? Well, yes. But he would also have found people cleaning up the mess, right? The animals would be gathered up, put back in their cages. The money, the coins that were scattered on the courtyard floor would have been picked up and put back. My guess is that also the tables that Jesus threw over, probably some of them broke, those would have been repaired. I think people coming the next day would have been assured that their sacrifices to God were still helpful and things would have been back to normal. Even so, the announcement was made. The old way was over. In Jesus, the new had arrived. I think we hear this story in Lent because what we know is that it takes a lifetime to reorient ourselves to what God would have us do. Because every week we bring our baggage to worship. We bring our need to justify ourselves, our fears, our anxieties. We bring our complaints, and we also bring our persistent, self-centered sins. Today's story reminds us that we all need cleansing. We need Jesus to chase away all the stuff that's accumulated during the week, all of our faulty thinking, all of our circular reasoning, all of our destructive habits and the clutter of our guilt. Jesus can drive all of that stuff away. And in the space that's left, he offers us forgiveness and a fresh start. He offers us another chance to to live from God's love and from grace. The kind of housekeeping that's reflected in this gospel lesson today, I've also found in a poem that was written by a woman who struggled with addiction in her family and in herself. It's called An Autobiography in 5 short chapters. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it's there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. Jesus invites us to walk down another street. No more being trapped in burdensome, circular thinking or superficial obligations. We don't have to follow the old way of meticulous obedience to rules that keep our hearts hidden, that keep us insulated from God. When we gather here, Jesus offers himself. And this gathering is not about us or about how well we follow the rules or what we do. It is not at all about anything that we have added to our primary relationship with God. We come here to meet the living Word, to be refreshed by Jesus' body and blood. We come here to find a love so healing, so complete, that we can go confidently from this place, refreshed and at peace. We can leave strengthened to be able to love and respond to other people who are as precious to God as we are. Thanks be to God. Amen.